The end of the story happened on a cold day, January 4, 2018. That was the day a massive company dropped a bomb on the city of Norwich. After keeping the factory running for 160 years, they announced that the doors were closing. It was a moment that felt like a knife in the back to the people who lived there. For generations, the workers in this city believed their jobs were safe, but suddenly, they were told that making their famous product was moving to a different town called Burton-upon-Trent, and some of it was even going all the way to Germany. But to really understand why this hurt so much, we have to look away from the empty factories and broken promises of today. We need to go back in time to see how this bond was built in the first place. It all started more than 2 centuries ago, in the year 1814. A man named Jeremiah Colman decided to take over a flour mill. This mill was located at Stoke Holy Cross, which was a small place just outside the city of Norwich. Jeremiah was a miller, so he knew how to grind wheat, but he wasn't satisfied with just doing that. He saw a chance to do something different with mustard. Back in those days, people in Britain had been eating mustard for hundreds of years, ever since medieval times. The problem was that it wasn't very good. The quality changed all the time, and you never knew how strong it would be. Usually, people would take mustard seeds and crush them by hand using a bowl and a heavy stick, known as a mortar and pestle. This old way of doing things made a powder that was rough and chunky. One batch might be okay, but the next one might be terrible. Jeremiah Colman looked at this problem and realized he could fix it. He was an expert at milling, so he invented a machine process to grind the seeds instead of doing it by hand. This machine changed everything. It created a powder that was super fine and always the same, every single time. This wasn't just about making the work faster, though. When the mustard seeds were ground down into such a fine dust, it opened up more of the seed. This released natural oils hidden inside the seed that create that burning, spicy feeling in your nose. Because of this new method, Colman's mustard was much smoother than anything else you could buy, and it also had a much bigger kick. He also wanted it to look distinct. He carefully picked a mix of brown mustard seeds and white mustard seeds. Then, he added turmeric, a spice that gave the powder a super bright yellow color. This color became the brand's signature look. Things moved quickly after that. In 1823, Jeremiah brought his nephew, James, into the business. They named the company J&J Colman, and business started to boom. They grew so big that they ran out of space. In 1854, they packed up and moved to a much bigger location called Carrow. This new spot was right on the banks of a river called the Wensum in Norwich. This was a very smart move. Being on the river meant they had plenty of water to run their processes. It also made it easy to bring in ships full of mustard seeds and send out boats filled with their finished yellow tins. This place, the Carrow Works, became the beating heart of the company for the next 165 years. A few years later, something happened that made Colman's the most important mustard in the country. In 1866, they got a special letter from Queen Victoria. She gave them a royal warrant, which officially made them the mustard makers for Her Majesty the Queen. In the Victorian era, this was a huge deal. It wasn't just a piece of paper to put in a frame. It told every person in Britain that this mustard was good enough for the Queen's dinner table. Immediately, everyone wanted to buy the same mustard the royals were eating. It was the best advertising they could have hoped for. From that point on, the city of Norwich started to turn yellow. You couldn't walk down the street without seeing the Colman's brand. Their signature bright color was painted on the vans that delivered the goods, on the signs above shops, and on advertising boards all over town. It was even on the shirts of the local football players. The Norwich City Football Club actually got their nickname, the Canaries, partially because they wore yellow kits that matched the city's famous mustard industry. If you walked through the city in the late 1800s, that cheerful yellow was everywhere you looked. Norwich had officially become the mustard city, and the Colman family were like the kings of industry there. The factory at Carrow kept hiring more and more people. For the time, the Colman family treated their workers surprisingly well. They were ahead of most other bosses. They built houses for the people who worked for them and set up schools for their children. They also made sure there was medical care available, and they built places for sports and social clubs. It was a much better life than what most factory workers had in those days. Because of this, the people living around the factory felt a deep connection to it. It wasn't just about getting a paycheck. The community cared about the product. Whole families worked there, passing the jobs down from parents to children. They were proud to be the ones making the best mustard in Britain. By the 1860s, Colman's wasn't just a local hit anymore. They were taking over the entire British market. They did this by using marketing ideas that were way ahead of their time. In 1855, they introduced their famous logo, a bull's head. The bull looked strong and serious, which told customers that this mustard was strong stuff. When you put that logo on those bright yellow tins, it created a brand that everyone in the country recognized immediately. The tins themselves were a genius invention. Mustard powder can go bad if it gets wet or sits in the light, so the metal tin kept it fresh and potent. But mostly, it was about standing out. When you walked into a grocery store, you could spot that yellow tin from across the room. No other sauce or spice looked like it. Every family knew that if they bought the yellow tin, they were getting proper, fiery British mustard. Even though they had great tins and a strong logo, the company had another trick up its sleeve. They had a clever saying that explained exactly how they made so much money, even though they never used this phrase in their official ads. The saying was that Colman's got rich not from the mustard people ate, but from the mustard they left behind on their dinner plates. This simple idea was actually very true. In Britain, people had a habit of putting a very large spoonful of mustard next to their food. Because the mustard was so strong and spicy, they almost never finished the whole pile they had served themselves. The leftover yellow paste would just get washed away when the dishes were done. For the company, this waste was perfect. The customers had already paid for that mustard, so every bit that was thrown away was pure profit. The company actually liked that their product was so hot and pungent because it tricked people into taking more than they could handle. As the years went by, moving through the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, this spicy yellow paste became a huge part of what people ate every day. You couldn't really have a proper Sunday roast dinner without it. It became a rule: if you were eating roast beef, you had to have Colman's, just like you can't have fish without chips. It cut right through the heavy taste of the meat and the gravy. It wasn't just for big fancy dinners, though. It was used in simple ham sandwiches to give them a kick. It was served with cheese and pickles, and it was a key ingredient in classic dishes like Welsh rabbit. The specific heat of this mustard became the flavor that everyone expected. Back at the factory in Norwich, the company wasn't just resting on its success. They were busy making their business better and bigger. The Carrow Works factory became famous as a model for how a factory should be run. Business owners from all over Europe would travel to Norwich just to see how they organized things. The site kept growing, adding new buildings and better machines to help the workers. By the time the 1900s began, there were thousands of people working there. They also started making more than just mustard. They realized they could sell other things, so they started producing starch to help people do their laundry, and a blue powder used to make white clothes look brighter. But even with all these new items, the mustard was still the most important thing they made. It was the product that paid for everything else and gave the company its name. No matter what else they sold, the British public only really cared about those yellow tins. The company understood this well. Mustard was their history and their claim to fame. As the British Empire grew and covered more of the map, Colman's went with it. They started sending their mustard to faraway places so that British soldiers and officials living overseas could still have a taste of home. Whether it was in India, Australia, Canada, or South Africa, you could find those yellow tins on the dinner tables. It was like sending a little piece of Norwich to every corner of the world. The company was very proud of this, seeing themselves as a truly British institution that existed everywhere the sun shined. Then, in 1939, everything changed with the start of the Second World War. The company didn't stop working. Instead, they became an important part of the war effort. The government's Ministry of Food took control of what was being produced. Colman started sending their mustard powder to army bases, navy ships, and military cafeterias all over the globe. For a soldier fighting in the deserts of North Africa or the fields of Europe, getting a tin of Colman's with their food rations was a big deal. It was a small, yellow reminder of their home and their family, even when they were thousands of miles away facing terrible danger. It might sound strange to say that a condiment is emotional, but for people who have been away from home for a long time, familiar food is very powerful. That spicy taste reminded them of Sunday dinners and peace. Back in Norwich, the factory itself was in the line of fire. Because Norwich was an industrial city, it was a target for enemy bombers. The German Air Force attacked the city many times. The Carrow Works factory had some very scary moments and close calls with the bombs, but the production lines never stopped. The workers showed up every single day, even when there was danger in the sky above them. This showed just how loyal the local community was. They kept the mustard moving out of the gates even when their city was burning. When the war finally ended, the company entered its best years yet. In the 1950s and 1960s, Britain was rebuilding, and people wanted things that felt safe and familiar. Colman's mustard was one of those things that made life feel normal again. During these decades, almost every single house in Britain had a yellow tin in the cupboard. It wasn't something you bought for a special treat, it was a basic necessity, just like buying salt, pepper, tea, or bread. The mustard also became a symbol of British personality. The French had their Dijon mustard, which was sophisticated. The Americans had their hot dog mustard, which was mild and yellow. But Britain had Colman's. It was hot, sharp, and didn't apologize for being strong. It matched how British people like to see themselves, straightforward and tough, with no nonsense. It was pure heat that cleared out your nose. The company kept inventing new things during this golden age. They realized that some people were too lazy to mix the powder with water, so they started selling ready-made mustard in jars. The true fans insisted that the powder was better, but the jars became popular too. They also tried making different types, like mild mustard or whole grain mustard, but the original powder in the yellow tin was always the favorite. Through all these changes, the factory at Carrow remained the center of life in Norwich. It was like a city inside a city. It had its own sports teams, social clubs, and traditions. It was very common to find families where the grandfather, the father, and the son had all worked at the same factory. The link between the city and the company was incredibly deep because they had shared more than 100 years of history. The company looked after the people, and the people were proud of the company. But now we have to get to the part of the story that makes people angry. In 1995, the world changed for Colman's. A massive company called Unilever, which was run by British and Dutch interests, decided to buy the food part of the business. They paid about £250 million for it. This sale marked the end of 180 years of the company being independent and run by locals. When Unilever bought the company, they made promises. They told everyone that they would keep making the mustard in Norwich. They said the historic Carrow Works factory would stay open and that the workers' jobs were safe. The people in Norwich were nervous about a giant international corporation taking over their local treasure, but they wanted to believe what they were hearing. After all, Colman's and Norwich were the same thing. Surely, even a huge company could see that this connection was important. For the first few years, it looked like everything was going to be okay. The factory kept running. The yellow tins still had the name Norwich printed on them. The workers still went to the same building that their parents had worked in. But secretly, things were starting to change. Unilever was a big corporation, and they did what big corporations always do. They started looking for ways to save money and make things more efficient. To the wealthy shareholders sitting in boardrooms in London and Rotterdam, the romantic idea of the mustard city meant absolutely nothing. When they looked at the Colman's factory, they didn't see a community or a proud history. They just saw one building in a huge list of properties owned by Unilever. They weren't thinking about tradition, they were thinking about math. Trouble started bubbling up in the early 2000s, and it began with the product itself. Loyal customers who had been eating this mustard for decades started to complain. They said it didn't taste right anymore. Some people claimed it wasn't as spicy as it used to be, while others said the texture felt different. The company insisted that nothing had changed and that they were still using the same recipe from the Victorian times, but the complaints didn't stop. The internet was full of arguments about whether the modern version was as good as the old one. People couldn't decide if the recipe had actually been tweaked to save money, or if their memories were just playing tricks on them. However, one thing was definitely true: the new owners were cutting costs. Teams of efficiency experts went through the factory looking for any way to save a penny. They questioned everything. They asked if they really needed to buy seeds from the expensive suppliers they had always used. They asked if they could use cheaper materials for the packaging. From a business point of view, these seem like normal questions, but they slowly destroyed the company's reputation for being the best. Colman's had never been about making things cheap, it was about making things perfect. The biggest change, however, was the distance. Decisions were no longer made by people who lived in Norfolk. They were made by executives who had never even set foot in the city. The feeling that the company actually cared about the town began to fade away. The workers could feel it, too. In the old days, the company felt like a strict but caring parent. Now, the loyalty only went one way, up to the bosses, not down to the workers. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, the company kept reorganizing. Management teams changed, and strategies shifted. The mustard was still being made at Carrow, but everyone knew something bad was coming. The promises made back in 1995 about keeping the factory in Norwich started to feel like lies. Workers who had planned to retire there started to worry that they would be the last generation to ever work inside those gates. Then, the hammer finally dropped. On January 4, 2018, Unilever made the announcement that everyone had been dreading. They declared that the Carrow Works factory would close its doors forever by the end of 2019. After 160 years of operation, it was over. They explained that making the mustard would move to a place called Burton-upon-Trent, and some parts of the packing process would even be moved to Germany. Officially, this decision cut 113 jobs. But the damage to the city was much deeper than just the numbers. The reaction was immediate and angry. A local politician named Clive Lewis called it a total betrayal of the workers. The trade union said it was devastating. But for normal people living in Norwich, it just felt like heartbreak. This wasn't just about money or economics, it was about who they were. Colman's was stitched into the fabric of the city, and ripping it out felt like ripping out the city's heart. The company gave the usual corporate excuses. They talked about consolidating and modernizing to stay competitive. It was the standard language that big companies use when they want to say, "We can do it cheaper somewhere else." All those promises about respecting the heritage of Norwich were forgotten because they were made by different managers in a different time. When the priority is cutting costs, 23 years of assurances don't mean anything. The process of closing down was handled with cold efficiency. Workers were offered money to leave. About 40 people were offered the chance to move to the new location in Burton-upon-Trent. But moving meant leaving behind their homes, their families, and everything they knew. Throughout 2019, the factory slowly wound down. By the end of the year, the very last batch of mustard rolled off the line. After 160 years, the machine stopped. Today, the Carrow Works site is silent. It stands like a giant graveyard for industry, full of memories and broken promises. For the people of Norwich, it is painful to look at. The buildings are still there, but there are no workers walking through the gates, and no smell of crushed mustard seeds in the air. It is a monument to what was lost, not just the jobs, but the pride of making something that defined British food. The strange part is that the mustard itself still exists. You can still walk into a supermarket and buy a yellow tin. The packaging still has Norwich written on it in big letters, using 200 years of history to sell the product, even though it isn't made there anymore. This makes many locals furious. There is also still a debate about the taste. Many longtime fans insist it isn't the same. Maybe it's psychological, knowing that your British mustard was made in Germany might change how your brain tastes it. Or maybe the recipe really did change during the move. Either way, loyal customers feel like the soul of the product is gone. The story of Colman's is actually a story about what has happened to all of British industry. It follows a sad pattern. A local company with deep roots gets bought by a massive international corporation. The corporation promises to protect the local history. Those promises last for a while, but eventually, someone finds a way to save money by moving production. The shareholders get richer, and the local community gets left with an empty building. The executives never have to look the workers in the eye and explain why 2 centuries of history were worth less than a slightly better profit margin. There is a bitter irony in all of this. Colman's was a brand built entirely on being British. The royal warrant from the Queen, the bull's head logo, and the yellow tin all screamed tradition. Yet, when it came down to it, none of that heritage could save it from the cold logic of global business. The mustard that defined British taste for 180 years is now just another generic product made wherever it is cheapest. Norwich has not forgiven them. The closure left scars that are still fresh. Some people in the city refuse to buy the products anymore because they feel that every penny they spend supports the company that abandoned them. Others still buy it out of habit, but they do it with sadness instead of pride. That bright yellow color, which used to be a sign of the city's glory, is now a painful reminder of what was taken away. So, that is the full story. It takes us from Jeremiah Colman's innovative flour mill in 1814 all the way to the corporate betrayal of 2019. It is a story that captures the best and worst of industrial history. Colman's wasn't just a condiment company. It was a community and a connection between a city and the rest of the country. It lasted for nearly 2 centuries until it became just another victim of the tragedy playing out across Britain, where companies are sold and stripped, and their heritage is kept only for the label on the jar.